Welcome to another episode of the WAN Manager Podcast. I'm your host, Bryan, and this is the show where we talk to networking experts about the data services that make business possible. Today, we're going to be living on the edge. So, whether we're talking about security and SASE, network as a service, cloud computing, a bunch of the other things that we talk about on this show, these days, edge is increasingly sort of getting into that conversation, but it's not something that we have specifically focused on any episode of the podcast yet. And so for that, I'm very pleased to welcome two experts on this topic from Catchpoint. We have with us Mehdi Dowdy, who is the CEO there, and Tony Forelli, who is VP of Operations. Welcome, Mehdi and Tony.
Thank you so much, Greg, for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. So as we almost always do, I like to start out the podcast with just a brief introduction from each of you on just a bit about your background and then more specifically what you're up to at Catchpoint.
Well, Tony and I have an amazing common background, the two of us. So we both worked at DoubleClick for many, many years. I was the VP of quality of service. So I was the guy with the monitoring tools. And Tony was running the network engineering team. And we had an interesting relationship,
right.
to say the least.
Yeah. Sometimes adversarial.
Right. And so I decided to leave after the Google acquisition. I decided to leave and start Catchpoint, which is a monitoring company. We are in the end user monitoring space. And I've kept in touch with Tony over the years. He ended up staying another 10 years at Google, doing all kind of amazing secret stuff that I'm sure he'll be more than happy to share. But I reached out to him pre-pandemic last year, and I said, listen, I really need some help because our infrastructure has grown and we're getting into other areas with the edge monitoring, employee experience monitoring, all that stuff. And I really need some help. So I reached out to Tony and he forgot the 5-6 years I made his life miserable at DoubleClick. Nature sometimes works in my advantage. And here he is. So Tony, I'll let you.
And to be able to get you away from Google, So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I mean, so I started at AT&T back when they first started their internet business, back when they were just reselling BBN Planet, if that name rings a bell to anybody from history. DoubleClick, the thing Mehdi doesn't say is that we had to serve one of those display ads in 200 milliseconds or less, right? Which was quite the feat, almost 20 years ago now.
Right. Yeah.
At Google, I worked on the peering. I managed the peering negotiation teams, ran some Google CDN services, and we started that Google Global Cache program, which I think was really, really a great thing. I think for ISPs around the world. I also did some custom network stuff with like open source Chromium and Firebase test labs. And then I was in corporate network for a while, running a Wi-Fi team and looking at user experience, right? How do we measure it? How do we make sure that we're actually delivering what we need to Google employees? So I had a nice wide variety of experience, but it's always been networking background. So Catchpoint was an easy play to jump back into, right? Like I said, we have a long history of working together. So it's been fun
absolutely.
So far.
Well, and I have to say that having two guests on the show that both also have a TeleGeography map behind them it makes me very happy. So.
And we're not kissing your butt, right?
Yeah.
So it's great.
Yeah,
we've always drooled over your maps.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Even back in the DoubleClick days, we've always had maps that try to depict the internet because people tend to forget how complex things are.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the cloud is making things. Which makes people forget how complex this stuff is. The outage this week of Fastly, I think, was a reminder that stuff breaks. This is cables and servers, and
there's a real world out there. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and remember too, like if things are just getting more complicated, right? Like the whole subject that we're talking about today with edge networking, and edge services, right? Like we're actually taking services and breaking them down into smaller components, right?
Right.
Microservices. And now instead of like one application, there's one application that a customer sees, but there's so many microservices that live there and they're so far distributed that it's making like the job of running this kind of stuff a lot more complicated. For operations people, you can't just be a straight like sysadmin anymore, or network engineer. You have to have a broader experience, right? You have to be in bed with the developers as they build these applications to make sure you're getting the right signals to understand what's happening on any component at any given time.
And that's a common theme as has been developing in security over the last few years too, where there used to be a pretty distinct silo in the enterprise of the security team and the network team, and now if you haven't already merged those teams, you're in big trouble, right? So the real impetus of this show was from a blog post that you wrote, Mehdi, called "Monitoring at the Edge of the Third Act of the Internet." So if you're listening to this, I suggest maybe pause and go check out that blog post. It was really illuminating, especially to read through. There's a diagram that I found pretty useful. So maybe to set things up for the rest of the conversation, Mehdi, could you explain what your framework that you used in that was? You called it the first, second, and third act of the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Tony will remember this because we worked on the second part of that together. But when I started playing with the internet was in '97, and that's when I was a sales engineer at DoubleClick, and I would go to customers and everything was so slow because first there was no Zoom or WebEx. We had to go and see customers.
Yes.
We were based in New York and we had this tiny little data center at 41 Madison Avenue, and which was an office building that wasn't supposed to host a data center to start with.
No,
but anyway,
course.
it's beyond that. And then I would go to California and latency is the killer, right? I mean, we know that. It's all about latency. So every packet had to travel from California to New York and back. And there was no, I mean, the best we had was a T1 at the time, right? And I still have a modem to remind me sometimes of what has happened over the last 20 years. Anyway, so everything was in a single data center and customers were so annoyed that everything was so slow. So we had two ISPs. So we introduced the second ISP in our data center. And so we had BBN and UUNet. And it was like, whoa, now we get to be able to load balance. Performance was still crap. And we said, okay, we have to find another solution. This is 97, 98. Guess what? There was a little company called Akamai that pops in, right? With the value proposition of, I am going to take your content, in our case, the banners, not the ad matching, because delivering ads requires two steps. One is you have to match which ad to serve. And that one is a fairly fast transaction. But the biggest one was like delivering those pop-up ads and whatnot. So I apologize for what I did all to you guys all these years. But So then Akamai came and he said, listen, we have this technology. It's really cool. We have these servers all around the world, and we can basically deliver content, closer to end users and reduce the latency. And that was the second act of the internet, where we started taking content and now breaking it and putting it in different locations, reducing latency. So that second act actually has lasted a long time now, right? Where we had multiple CDN come and go, different methodologies, like an Akamai methodology, which is like hundreds of thousands of servers everywhere, versus, let's say, an Edgecast or Fastly, which is like, okay, bigger pops, closer, but then a lot of servers in each one of them. The third act is what Tony said earlier, which is now the last mile. So I live in Los Angeles. It's a very big city. I think the closest data center I have is one Wilshire, probably, right? That's where most of LA goes to. But it's still far. I mean, there are certain applications like a Zoom or video conferencing where maybe even 10 milliseconds is very, very far away. And I think what we had to endure during COVID has taught us that latency is even more important for productivity at home.
Well, and even just to stop you there and just bring home the point that, when you're talking to the multinational enterprise, they're loving it with their office that's in downtown LA getting to One Wilshire, right? Because
Sure.
they're having sites that would be getting to One Wilshire from
Right.
say rural Nevada or worse, right? Yeah. So yeah. Sorry. So
And what we're seeing, and absolutely, and what we're seeing now is, again, latency. The physics of latency are not going to change. Speed of light is speed of light, and so it's really about compressing that. And how can you compress it? It was by getting even closer and closer and closer to the end user. Number one, and number two is what Tony said earlier: is you have to break down those things, those big applications, into smaller chunks. And that's what we're seeing, right? You have a microservice that lives here that might be on the edge, so something closer to the end user. And then maybe another microservice that is maybe not as latency dependent, and that thing can live in an AWS or a Google Cloud or whatever, or a traditional Equinix kind of data center. But it's really about latency. That's what our customers are telling us, is we need to get closer to the last mile. Tony, I don't know if you have expertise to add on that latency. I've been asking you to squeeze latency for 20 years. So.
Right. I mean, and if you look at the structure of the internet and different ISPs, right, they peer in different locations, and it's usually in those big markets. And you can actually look at the TeleGeography map, right. Not to kiss your butt again, but I mean, it shows you where the major peering centers are in the world, right? And there's not that many of them.
Right.
But like what we're seeing, like over the last 10 years, there's been a really great evolution of having local peering exchanges, right, that show up in different metros now, right, that are helping aid that interconnect. So if you're in Raleigh, North Carolina, you don't have to travel all the way up to Ashburn, right, to be able to connect to a service that lives on a different ISP, right? And I think most businesses realize now that multi-homing is super important from an ISP perspective. And I think with the Fastly outage that we saw, earlier this week, that's starting to evolve now. And now people are starting to think about, I got to do multi-CDN, I got to do multi-cloud, and now these edge services become more and more important.
Yeah. And it's, important to remember sort of how far we've come and how recently some of these almost like your second stage hurdles have just been overcome. Yeah, I think of a case like in Brazil until fairly recently. Well, Google did have a data center in Santiago, Chile, but of course there was no way to get from Brazil to Chile, right? And so it was still the case until fairly recently. I mean, just a few years ago, that if you sent an email to someone across town in Sao Paulo, your email was going to Miami, Napa, the Americas, or whatever, and then tromboning back on that path, right? So we were just now getting to that. Yeah.
And Greg, that is still happening in many, many other markets.
Absolutely.
In APAC, in India. In India, you have to get out, because the Indian network was built mostly from an outside mind rather than inside.
Right.
Most of the traffic still gets out of India, goes to Europe, and comes back to India. We're seeing a lot of this weirdness between Hong Kong and India, for example. There is so much routing that is, politically, whether it's real politics or business politics. That is directed by some of these corporations. It's insane. And again, latency is very important. So they're doing a disservice to the end users, and it's an end user market. It's all about that customer experience, right? We saw it. We just saw it this week. Everybody was enraged. I couldn't get to CNN. I couldn't get to this. I couldn't get to that.
Yeah.
It's really about latency.
No, I'm glad that you brought up that sort of aspect of it, because obviously this is the WAN Manager podcast. We're focused on enterprise apps, right? When I'm thinking about sort of Akamai and their history, it was I often think of more sort of the eyeball apps, right? Like Netflix, YouTube. Obviously, those were one of the first big use cases for that. Sure. But then the enterprise, UCaaS kind of models and all that tend to sort of trail behind the consumer services, in a way, right? Like that we were all using Skype, with each other long before there was Skype for Business as an enterprise solution, right? So it seems often that it kind of, the enterprises are following in those consumer footsteps. What do you think of from the enterprise kind of standpoint as sort of the killer apps for edge, or is it just there's so
All
much
of them.
potential, right? Yeah,
All of them, Greg.
So much
You know,
potential. Yeah.
there
Sorry.
was, no worries, Tony. So I listened to the CIO of Nutanix many years ago. I was at this conference, and she had this incredible story. She said, I go home and I say, Alexa, turn on the light, and it works. Alexa, play this, boom. And I come to my office and I spent $1 million on a teleconferencing system, and I need 13 engineers to turn on the TV.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think what's happening, and I think what COVID has done, is a consumerization of corporate IT. And there is no going back. There is no going back. We're going to have to deal with security, don't get me wrong, right? But people are realizing that, hey, my computer at home is better than the one you're giving me. It's 4 years old. My Wi-Fi is better. My this is better. My that is better. I mean, 90% of the time, right?
I get a 20 meg MPLS port at the circuit at the office, and I get 500 from Fios or Comcast at home. Right? So,
well, but it's consumer grade, so you have to take that into account.
It's contended.
Right?
It's contended. Sure. Yeah.
But the challenge now is, again, going back to the latency. Sorry for being a latency sucker here, but I have, in my case, in my tiny little case of Catchpoint of 300 employees, I have a lot of people that are no longer living in New York or San Francisco or in the main centers. I have people that have moved to Tennessee, to New Hampshire, to
Montana,
and they're no coming back, right? So their expectation is like Salesforce needs to run as well as what it was in the office.
Right.
But Salesforce, are you using an Akamai or Fastly, whatever? I don't know. I don't think so. Their performance is not that great. And they had an outage just a few weeks ago themselves, right? You know, there's this typical trend that the summer is like the summer of outages kind of thing. But this end user thing mentality needs to follow from a consumer to an employee side. Sorry.
But I mean, look at that. And we're actually, a good example of that evolution. So I run corporate IT also for Catchpoint, and we have nothing in the office. There is no service that any user needs to connect to in the office anymore. Everything is a SaaS application. Google's been doing it for years, right? Like there's this concept of Beyond Corp, right, that they've written papers on, where services no longer have to live where the users live. Services live off on the internet somewhere else. Right. So that just behooves you even more. And how, like, if I need to share a file, I want to do it. And I don't want to wait 45 minutes, right, to go do that. So that local NaaS server doesn't exist anymore. And especially now we're all working from home, having those cloud storage options become really, really valuable, right? So you can splay like this. And those offices now don't become a security hole for you, right? Like that office is now a Starbucks, right? I can go work from anywhere. Right. I don't have to work from that office anymore because there's nothing there except for a bunch of network ports. Maybe there's a few phones left, right? But most of that's VoIP now anyway. So who cares?
Exactly.
Right. Or are you using VCs? Google's been using we joined in 2008. We were using VCs back in 2008. Google Hangouts was the primary way we communicated, right? Now it's slowly taken over, right? People still don't turn on cameras, which I find annoying, but it is what it is, right? It's a great way to communicate and stay in touch with each other. So, obviously that part of it is great, but then offices want to, IoT is like the big use case. Like you hear about IoT, you hear about IoT security, you want those things to be fast. I want a light to turn on when I walk in a room. Right. When somebody walks in the room, I want my VC screen to pop up with what meeting is supposed to be on at that time when you walk into that conference room. These are all things that have to happen like that.
Yeah, well, and you're talking about sort of productivity or just like, office stuff, but especially if you're in the IoT business where it has to do some amount of compute or, a manufacturing facility or whatever, right? Then having that compute happen in real time to drive the robot, that's right, or whatever.
Yeah, because you're talking about something that doesn't have much power, right? It's, it's tiny sitting in that office that controls the light shades, right? Or that, that senses when somebody enters a room.
I mean, we have customers that use us to monitor their robots that are manufacturing cars.
Right.
So, and it's all, again, it goes, and the brain is in AWS or Google Cloud, and then the robots need to talk to that. It's like, okay, so what's the latency to an AWS from whatever location they are, right? And so, that latency, that reliability. We talk to our customers about these 4 pillars that are extremely important: reachability, performance, availability, and then reliability. Can I get to you?
Mm-hmm.
Are you up or down? Are you slow, fast? And how consistently can you deliver that level of quality of service, whatever that is, to your customers? That concept of reliability is also extremely important.
Yeah, so you bring up a great point then, and just bringing up, okay, I need to ping AWS. So think of it that way. AWS has a couple of dozen or so cloud regions around the world, right? So if you happen to be close to one of those couple of dozen cloud regions, maybe this hasn't become that big of an issue for you. I'm in Northern Virginia. Literally, the biggest concentration of data centers in the world is down the street, right? So it may not change my life radically if something was off the edge, but what I want to get at in thinking about this third act of the internet is where exactly do you think we mean for that edge? There's from the service provider standpoint, are you talking about maybe like central offices? Everybody knows the little windowless brick building that's in their neighborhood somewhere with a Verizon or a CenturyLink or whatever sign on it, right? Or are you talking about on the customer premises? We just spent all this time moving the data center into to off campus sites, and now we're going to move it back, but just atomized. Is that what we're talking about?
What's your take, Tony?
All right. I think it's some of that's true, right? But I think the thing that you're doing with like containerization and stuff like that is even though it's on site, it's still abstracted from you. You're still using the same tool sets to not only manage that portion, but also the whole infrastructure that's living off in the ether, right, in the cloud. So, there's going to be use cases that I think we're still exploring and still figuring out. Like, I think, the killer one is like Stadia, and I think Microsoft's offering something now with streaming gaming, right? There's that Twitch level that you need, right, to do that really quickly. And, I think Stadia's done a really good job with some of that in the markets that they're in. But then you go outside a certain latency range, right? And then it becomes sort of unusable if you're doing stuff competitively. So I think a lot of thought. I think we're still in the early stages of starting to figure out what's important and how do we break up these services so I can move the most important components out to that edge. And then where is that edge, right? Like, we keep on hearing IoT and 5G and stuff like that and the combinations, and Amazon just came out with wavelength, right, with Verizon and KDDI and a couple of others. And these are really super interesting use cases, but I'm kind of interested to see where they go, right? Like what's going to be that killer application that actually drives that? And then the other piece of it is, can your teams handle that complexity that you're now adding into that application?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
like how do you peel off that microservice that needs that low latency and still maintain the bulk of it somewhere else? Because, the easy solution is go back to the old way, right? Drop a server in the building and call it a day.
That's
right?
what I was getting at. Exactly. Yeah.
It can't be that. It can't be that.
Right.
It will be unmanageable. I think. Tony said it nicely. First is understanding what does edge mean to you, Mr. Customer, and every customer is going to have different requirements. Whether you're a car or a super low latency robot that is performing a surgery at Cedar Sinai, that stuff needs microseconds is extremely important. I think edge physically is going to be not so much in the big cities, in my opinion. That's me. It's the rural areas. It's the farms in Iowa. Can we deliver the internet and applications with a certain level of latency to a school that is in the middle of nowhere, that is far away? That, by the way, because COVID, hopefully we won't deal with another COVID for a little while, right? But COVID is the result of population, travel, connected world, all that stuff. The likelihood of another SARS-related thing might happen again and again and again. And I think we got trained this past 3 years on how to be completely distributed, right? And I think this is going to open up the door to a lot of things. Maybe we don't need to all live in New York or San Francisco or in DC. Maybe we can spread and And so, but then as a user, I want a great experience no matter what it is, no matter where I am. And I think that's what's going to dictate what goes where in terms of what edge is. But it's really about, for me, edge is literally delivering an amazing user experience to employees, customers, devices, anywhere in the world within X milliseconds, right? We don't have to dial back a modem at 28.8K and say, okay, this is the internet. Those days are over.
That's a great point. Something I often talk about when introducing people to, sort of the geography of the internet, right? These maps that we have behind us, is that if you overlay that with air travel, shipping lanes and actual ports, it all matches up very, very neatly, right? The submarine cables are on the major shipping routes and the major flight routes, and so all of that infrastructure development has been concentrated. And if we have a sort of a decentralization of work and people, then we have to decentralize the data too.
Absolutely. And the thing that for me, the best example of what edge means is also almost like what SpaceX is doing with their internet satellite service. I mean, they're not going to be the only one. Probably others will
Kuiper,
join.
perhaps,
Right. So if we're going to have this internet coverage that is via satellite, well, then where's the latency, right? I mean, I don't know if you remember, but when we used to fly, we used to get GoGo Flight, right? And GoGo Flight will connect you if you do a trace route while you were on the plane.
Oh, yeah.
It will trace route back to wherever you took off. So if I took off from LA, I will trace route just to LA. When I would land in New York, I was still going to LAX for some reason, right? But I think with SpaceX, I don't know how the networking is being done. We're still waiting for a few of our nodes to go live there. But that's going to change where the edge is, because the users are going to be everywhere. They're going to be connected to the internet via satellite, and then you are dealing with very weird latency requirement again there. So.
And I think that's going to be one of the challenges that we come up with, right? So, with Starlink, that's the SpaceX service, right? That's, there's ground stations positioned all over the place, right? Where that traffic kind of aggregates and comes out.
Right.
So I'm assuming at some point services are going to want to move closer to those ground stations, right? But now proximity becomes like this key equation, right? Like we've had this loose geolocation system, right? That sort of works. Like where's that IP address coming from? But like with IPv6 and stuff, it's becoming, much more complex now, right? Like how do I tell where that user is? Yeah. So like, it's going to be really interesting to see how systems evolve with that.
Or what Apple just announced this week with the iOS 15, that privacy thing that they're launching is going to change the whole geo IP load balancing that we've been doing, because they're going to tunnel all the traffic through a CDN of commercial CDNs, but the IP address is masked, the DNS server is masked, and all of the technologies that we use to load balance and geolocate and georoute are gone.
Yeah, it becomes interesting. Like we even looked at like 8.8.8.8 and 1.1.1.1, those DNS services, right? And how they do location. And what's really fascinating about them is because there's so many people asking questions, asking for answers from them, right? That you kind of get sticky and you can actually watch the patterns, right, as they grow. And sometimes that's not that useful. Right? Sometimes that's not good.
Right.
So it's really fascinating to kind of dig into this and see like how is this going to evolve with edge computing, right? Like, like the AWS wavelength thing with Verizon. So now they live on Verizon's backbone, right? Verizon wireless backbone. So now they have that service, but like AT&T is going to do something different. T-Mobile is going to do, maybe they'll go with, Google or Azure or something like that. Now you have to think as an enterprise or as somebody that wants to run a business that uses those services. Now you not only have to support one, but you really have to drive to multi-cloud if you want to hit all those networks and get that value that they're providing. Right? This is the whole reason why like centralized CDNs and independent CDNs became really important. All these providers like Comcast and AT&T, they all tried to spin up their own CDN services, right? And they all pretty much failed because HTTPS. everything's encrypted.
Right.
And that was done on purpose, right? That was done on purpose because I don't want to have to talk to you and talk in your language about how I want my caches done, right? I want to be able to do that independently and run it one way. Right? And the big companies like Google and Facebook and Netflix have the clout to go and do that. But it's the smaller guys that kind of suffer and might have to play this multi-game, right? And dealing with each individual one to make stuff happen. So like I said, it's really going to be fascinating to watch how all this stuff evolves. And does it get easier? Right? Does it get easier?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question in terms of there's always a market opportunity to bring simplicity to a complex sort of situation.
Exactly.
But that can only happen if it's not like totally controlled by a huge managed service provider who has everything, vertically integrated and that sort of thing, right? Yeah. So.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about monitoring, that since that is where your sort of real expertise here lies, or you kind of set up the stage. So Edge has this sort of promise in facilitating all these novel apps and capabilities, but there's always a yin to the yang, right? So, you've touched on this a bit, but can maybe go through sort of what challenges you think this is going to pose from a network management kind of standpoint, and do you think those challenges or issues are maybe different for the service providers providing networks than they are to the end users themselves, perhaps?
I think it's an excellent question. I think it's a very complex answer. The first is, I believe that it's always about the end user. Even in my DoubleClick days, my arguments with Tony were always about the end users are complaining, and Tony's answer, yeah, but my network is up.
Right.
And the answer was like, that's great that your network is up, but the end users are complaining. So, let's solve it, right?
I actually had a T-shirt made up that said, "It's never the network."
Right. And I used to steal his T-shirts and burn them. Yeah. But anyways, it's really about the end users. Now, the end users are exploding. They're everywhere. They are demanding. They are consuming more and more services, and they're consuming more and more services from many, many, many devices. Whether it's an iPad, computer, whether it's Ethernet or Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi 6 or IPv4. I mean, IPv4, IPv6. I was troubleshooting something with the customer the other day on IPv6. And it's just like, imagine your mom getting on, asking your mom to do a trace route and getting her to give you an IP address, and she's looking at an IPv6 address, and it's like, how do you even troubleshoot that, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
Bottom line is, things are getting so complex. So that's number one. Number two is, Tony said something is like, it was interesting. We had an SLA, him and I. We literally had service level agreements between teams at DoubleClick, and our service level agreement was every ad, all the ads that we served, and we served that. By the time I left in 2008, we were serving about 40 billion ads a day, right? So anything with billions is huge. So 40 billion transactions a day is huge. And literally, our service level agreement was like 99.9% of all the things that we served had to happen within less than 150 milliseconds. And we measured all of them. And we measured real user, we measured synthetically, we measured all kind of things. Again, doing this 20 years ago was pretty cool. Today, I have kids I have a 12-year-old that comes and knocks at my door and breaks my door and said, there is lag on the Wi-Fi. Right. It's like, where the hell did you learn this stuff, right? Yeah. Because he's playing a game, and 2 millisecond latency or 3 millisecond latency, that's it. He's like, he lost, right? So monitoring needs to happen where it matters the most, which is the end users, number one. You still need to monitor all your other stuff, your network gear, your servers, your containers, your whatever, right? CPU, memory, the whole nine yards, nothing changed. The problem now is your multi-cloud, your multi-disk, your multi-network, and it's just like the complexity of monitoring has gotten out there as well. And so now we're talking about observability, you have to observe, whatever. And but I feel like we are, with this level of complexity, monitoring has gotten to the point where does it even make sense to look at dashboards anymore? I mean, what's the evolution of monitoring needs to be around automation. I think that's where we all as monitoring companies need to get to the point where we need to start automating things, because we're not talking about 2,000, 1,000 servers, 50 servers anymore. We're talking about containers I have customers that are running 400,000 containers.
Mm-hmm.
In 5 cloud vendors in every region of every cloud vendor. I mean, it's just insane. How do you monitor all of that?
Right. You need a knock bigger than the whole IT team, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And by the way, you cannot hire people to look at stuff anymore.
Right.
Nobody wants to look at stuff anymore.
Yeah, no, the only thing I was going to add to that, right, is, Mehdi talked about that whole picture. So like with these microservices, teams are getting fragmented now, right, where they're focused on their service, right? They don't care about the whole picture.
Right.
And so I think it's really important for folks to come back and make sure that there's a team that understands the whole, everything in that value chain that end user's looking at, right? Not just their component, right? And now it's even harder because the network is actually abstracted, right? So you're actually not doing network monitoring anymore. You're running this microservice that runs in a cloud that sits on a network that you can't see. Right. So now you have to figure out for those microservices, what's my proxy for that? Am I going to measure latency? How am I going to measure that? What am I going to measure? Right. And you have to build these abstractions that kind of give you an indication of how the network's performing, so you can eliminate that as part of the equation, because you can't see it. Right. It's not there anymore. Right. And then when you look at the whole picture, somebody has to understand, right, from beginning to end, what's the input, what's the output, and how fast should it happen? And somebody has to be looking at that to be able to drive into those micro teams, now those microservices teams, to go figure out where the problem lies, right? So tracing things all the way through becomes super important.
Right. I mean, Tony, what you said is so important. One of the biggest challenges I see happening in various industries, verticals, companies, whatever you want to call them, is because teams have become so decentralized. So you have a dev team that goes and does something, and they go and buy their own monitoring tools because freedom has been given, which is great. So you have one team using this, another team using this, another team using that, whatever. But at the end of the day, there is nobody, and this is one thing that I see 99% of the time with our customers, is there is not a single team that looks at that end to end. When I took over the monitoring at DoubleClick, when we created that monitoring team, was actually to defeat this thing, because Tony and his team had network monitoring tools. The system guys had their own system things, blah blah blah, and it was like literally I would walk into a knock at the time, and it's like, guys, everything is bad. It's like, no, maybe look, the systems are good. This is good. Everything was green.
My interface has never had errors. That's all I had.
Right, exactly. Right. It's never. But so when we created this department that literally was called Quality of Services, and it was the Uber monitoring that would solidify and just like looks at things from an end to end, ad speed, media speed, ad delivery, transaction integrity. I mean, we went crazy above all things. But by being unified, we all started speaking the same language. We stopped that meantime to innocence, which is like, okay, who do I blame? And we stopped like having people buying tools just so they can prove that it's not their stuff. It's not the network. It's not the hard drives. It's not this. So that's one thing I would highly recommend, is even if it's one person in your organization, have one guy that looks at the most critical business service, whatever that might be, and just like look at it from an end to end. Try to do that, and try to have service level agreements that are meaningful between your vendors, between teams. I think having that common language is extremely important. And then stop with this, let's collect more data business. I mean, that's one thing I see, is just like, let's keep collecting more and more and more and more data. I was talking to a friend of mine who works at a very big cloud company. It's like 99.99999% of the data is never looked at.
Right. Yes. I mean, that's a problem in every aspect of business now, right? So it's the flood of data, and what KPIs are actually useful and which ones are just being collected for the sake of it, right? Yeah. Right.
Right. And even actionable. I mean, you have to ask, I tell this to my team, it's like, why? Start with why. Why do you need to collect this data? Whether it's a business data or whatever, whether it's my CFO or my team, it's like or an engineering team. Why are you collecting that data? Can I do anything with it? Yes. Oh, great. No, then it's just like it's a lot of work for somebody to fill that Excel spreadsheet or that data system or whatever. It's useless. Get rid of it.
So it sounds like a lot of what you're saying is that when thinking about the great complexity, there's almost as much of a cultural change needed within the enterprise as a technological change, so that you can pull back and have someone who can really understand what should I even have an SLA on, right? It's very simple in the MPLS world. My SLA is on my MPLS circuits, right? But and who do I get that SLA from, right? It's not my carrier if I've gone to a strategy of a bunch of different ISPs around the world, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had an interesting because one of our new products is around the employee experience. So it's a little software that sits on the endpoints on computers at the end user levels to monitor Salesforce and Zoom and whatever, right? And so this particular customer used this SASE vendor that has also some telemetry. They gather some telemetry, and so the customer looked at our data, and we said that on average, that application, the CRM application, was only available 70% of the time, which is terrible, by the way, right?
Yeah.
And but the other vendor, the SASE vendor, was like, no, 100% availability, right? And then at the end of the day, we went and asked the employees, like, did you not have any problem? It's like, are you kidding? I couldn't do my job. I couldn't enter this deal in the CRM. I couldn't look up the customer in the CRM. So there were problems. Oh, absolutely, right. And here's the data, whatever. So the other thing, when you said about where you get the data from, is extremely important. It's the hen and the hen house, right? The wolf and the hen house, kind of like who's monitoring, who's watching. Those kind of things are very important. I mean, we have 850 locations we run our data centers from. We have 500 ISPs we have contracts with. Yeah, their SLAs are fantastic, and I leave it as that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I guess my question now becomes kind of having set all of this up, where do you think the market is with adopting, both ends of this kind of service, both the edge services as well as, of course, being able to monitor that edge? It sounds like it's pretty nascent yet. Is that the case?
On the monitoring side, it's not as much. I think it's very developed. I think what we're seeing is the maturity. So it starts always with availability. People care about availability, right?
Right.
It's a very hard transition to go from up down to performance. And nobody wants to sign up for performance issues, right? It's like, well, now you're asking me to guarantee that I will deliver this homepage or this login page in 300 milliseconds, but it's John over there and it's Jane over there. And oh, by the way, it's AWS. And so there is this, I don't want to own this problem, but anyway, but it happens. It ends up happening because customers are demanding.
Right.
So the performance one is a very interesting second point of the maturity model. The biggest hurdle is the reliability, because it's very expensive to deliver reliability. When an Apple delivers 99.999% of reliability, they put a lot of money behind that, right? They are multi-cloud, they are multi-this. They're the same with Google, the same with it's not everybody can deliver the reliability that you get from a Google, right? But everybody wants that. So so that's one problem I see is the maturity model that starts with availability, first reachability, availability, performance, and reliability. The jump from availability to performance is still very difficult for people to grasp. Then on the edge services, I would tell folks, just make sure you distribute your systems in as many places as possible. I mean, that's the multi-CDN. I think the lesson learned this week is, again, multi-CDN,
Yeah.
multi-DNS, multi-cloud
Yeah.
vendor, because things will fail. So, if everybody cares about reliability and availability, then make sure that you're available. Start with that.
Right. I mean, it's the same concept that we've always had in sort of the last mile from the enterprise standpoint of I have to ensure that my two providers are leaving the office on different different ducks, right? Yeah.
Make sure the risers are different, make sure paths are different.
Right. And by the way, this problem of last mile, this is not just an internet problem. This is, when you think about even in e-commerce and in commerce in general, the companies that have done extremely well is Walmart. But guess what? They have stores in areas where
right.
So
they have that reach already physically, right? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And then the other one is Amazon, where you can order something and get it delivered in 2 hours. Yeah. And by the way, Target does the same thing today or whatever. So I think everybody's understanding that it's all about the last mile. So it's all about the edge. At the end of the day, it's all about the edge. Whether the edge is me wanting Tylenol delivered to my house in 2 hours, or me being able to watch a movie, download 5 gigs in like 2 seconds. It's all about the last mile. And companies, the successful ones, have learned that a long way. Whether it was Sears, Walmart, now Amazon, Whole Foods.
Right. Well, and to that very specific point, that there is a physical geography reality for bits just as well as there is for tennis shoes and Tylenol, right? So
correct.
Absolutely, right. And like everybody's got to remember, BGP is a protocol that doesn't care about performance.
Yes,
it's a business. It's about business relationships, right? In the end, that's really what it is. You can have some gross controls, but like you can't really fine tune it, and you can't do it based on performance. So there has to be these overlay services that help you figure that out, right? And that's what I was talking about before about how do I know that, Mehdi sitting in LA or Mehdi sitting in the middle of Topeka is going to get really good performance, right, from an application. And that's a really hard thing to go and solve.
See, on this offline world, Greg, IKEA, there was a business case study. It's a fascinating one. IKEA opening a tiny store in the middle of Manhattan.
Very different than their normal model, which has come to us centralized,
correct.
Right?
Correct, because what they did is they adapted to the population in Manhattan. People in Manhattan don't need big furniture.
Right.
People in Manhattan maybe just want to go to IKEA to buy bulbs or batteries. So they adapted. And so that for me is that edge definition. It's like, you see, there is a big data center that shrank, and went in the middle of Midtown Manhattan to deliver a particular service to that population. They still go to the big IKEA on the weekend, but they have to rent a car.
Yeah. And you have the economies of scale there, but sorry, go ahead.
Right.
Yeah.
There's still a value proposition for having those big data centers, right? Because not everything has to be latency sensitive, right? And there's going to be a cost savings associated with that. So now businesses are going to have to make that more complex decision about figuring out what that right balance is. I mean, how many of us out there that use Amazon services or Google services, right, buy the wrong resource for a longer period of time, right? Or, buy a reserved instance or something like that, right? Like now you're going to be committing to something that's going to be much more expensive that sits on the edge. So you better be sure about like what your performance goals are by doing that, right? And then, like I said, making sure that the whole value chain down, the developers, the operations people, everybody that supports that can actually support it in a way that's meaningful. Right.
Yeah.
So I think, to your earlier point, this is an evolution, right? Like we're going to see what happens over the next few years and see how things like streaming gaming and video conferencing and stuff take advantage of edge, IoT, which that one I'm on the fence on. Like I'd like to understand a little bit more. I'd like to see some really good use cases, right? Because as people develop them, then I think it'll become a lot clearer. Right now, I still think marketing will tout it till the cows come home.
Absolutely.
But I think it's still not tangible yet, right? About really what that value is there, except for some very specific use cases.
Right. And not to get into this topic so late in the game, but I mean, similar with 5G is that, there's potential overlap here with, the ability to do network slicing, replacing of Wi-Fi at the campus level and that sort of thing. But we need to see some real life deployments and what applications they're running. And, so
Yeah, like super SASE, like CBRS and stuff like that. Those are really interesting technologies. The question is will they ever replace Wi-Fi? I don't think so, but like, let's see, right? There might be a killer use case out there that we haven't thought of yet. So let's see what it is.
Bottom line is we live in an amazing time.
Yeah.
There's so many possibilities. Yeah. And it's just, all of this is just going to create more innovation. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, and so to bring home sort of maybe a key takeaway, if I get your sign off on this for the the WAN manager, right? That is the name of the show. Yeah. I think one of them, in addition to, of course, a sort of understanding, all of these complexities, being able to understand how your monitoring actually works. For that, it's also more, again, of a cultural thing of bringing together DevOps, bringing together the data center team, bringing together the cloud team, the security team, having them all understand what should be sitting where, how do I get to that, and how do I make sure that it's actually working, right? And so
don't forget about the networking team.
And then, of course, well, that's what I'm saying. This is from the WAN manager, him or herself, right? Yeah. So maybe now the networking team becomes this sort of centralized coordinator of all of these disparate needs, right? So, yeah.
I mean, the internet is the new LAN.
Yeah.
I mean, exactly. That's literally the WAN, the LAN. There is no more of any of these things. It's just like one big thing.
Right. That you just need access onto it, and then it happens over the top or whatever. Right. Yeah, exactly.
And it's an autobahn, right? And you want to make sure that it's working and people can go as fast as they can, and as safely as they can. I think that's the big thing as well, security.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was an excellent talk, guys. Thank you so much. Very, very illuminating.
Pleasure.
So I always like to wrap the show up with a little something fun. I'm still in that phase where I'm asking kind of the same question to everyone, which is, what are you going to do now that a bunch of us are fully vaccinated? What is the one thing that you've been missing the most that you can't wait to get back to?
Going out to eat. Right?
Yeah,
just going out to a restaurant and sitting down and having a really nice meal with my wife and enjoying that. Right, I get that. Super excited for that. We actually did it this week. So
nice, excellent.
I was pretty excited to get that done and tick that one off the list.
Yeah, awesome.
Well, I used to fly 400,000 miles a year.
Oh man,
work, pleasure. Yeah, and I went to zero, and so I think. I want to get back on a plane. I want to go and see people. I want to travel. I had my first business lunch yesterday, and it was very awkward. It's like, okay, what should we do? Shake hands, right? Should we give hugs? I don't know. And so that was hilarious. But it's nice to go back to normal. There are certain things that I don't miss at all, like the commute, and I think those things are going to be fantastic. But being with people is the one thing I miss the most.
Yeah, I haven't been on a plane since December of 2019, which I think might be the longest stretch, certainly in my adult life. Yeah. I'm kind of happy about that, I'll be honest. It's not my favorite thing, but I totally get the end result is great. You get to see people. That's wonderful.
Right. But you know what? Funny enough, I've always enjoyed. I mean, I travel so much, I get upgraded 99.5% of the time. So there was always this thing I always loved is the airplane food and. I don't know, there is this thing that you're traveling, that you're going somewhere, even when it's exciting, even when it's crap, right? So I miss that part.
Absolutely. Well, I wish everybody the best of luck on getting back to normalcy there, and let's check in again sometime, because this was a great conversation, and I think there'll be a lot more to talk about in the future as things develop. So thanks. Have a good one.
Thank you so much for having us, and keep up with the great maps.
Yeah, thanks. Will do. Absolutely. All right. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for listening. The WAN Manager podcast is brought to you by TeleGeography, a division of Primetrica Incorporated, and is edited and produced by Jane Miller. I wrote the theme song you're listening to right now, and we get administrative canine support from my dog Honeybun, who you might hear chiming in from time to time when the mood strikes her. If you want to learn more about our data, head over to telegeography.com, where you can find our blog that covers many of the topics we hit here, and you can sign up for our WAN Manager newsletter. Until next time, have a great day. So guess what, folks? We got some big news at TeleGeography, and that is that we just launched our WAN forum. What is a WAN forum? Well, this is a content hub and community for anyone involved in the management of a WAN or in IT infrastructure for mid to large enterprises. And it's got all the analysis and content that you enjoy from TeleGeography related to the WAN, plus some extra videos, some interviews, and some special tools that we've designed just for inclusion here, like our SD-WAN vendor selector, a high-level WAN cost calculator to give you some ideas of what market prices are. Basically, if you like the kind of stuff that we talk about on this podcast, and you're an end user, we think that you'll enjoy the WAN forum. And of course, this is a space meant to be shared, which is why a WAN forum subscription includes access for up to 20 members of your team. So check it out by heading to wanforum.com. We'll be adding some new tools, constantly adding new analysis, and announcing some upcoming WAN forum events very soon. So you want to make sure you bookmark that. That's wanforum.com. We can't wait to see you there and for you to dive in.